All right. Well, thank you all for coming for the second talk. And I also thank the people who have coordinated this talk and brought me here, as well as the El Dorado bookstore, who very generously gave us this space to use. So tonight's topic, you people call flock immunity, which is pretty similar to what we call herd immunity, just using different animals. And unfortunately, it makes us feel a bit like animals when we are told that we need to be part of this, what to me appears to be an illusory concept. So I tried to make this just a 1-hour talk, I will tell you. The problem is that the medical system often uses something called the KISS principle. I don't know if you've ever heard that. K-I-S-S. Keep it stupid. Keep it simple, stupid. And it's very simple for them to do that because they're putting a message out that is meant for compliance and for fear. And so they narrow it down to the most simple terms. But I find that in order to really describe what's happening, it has to be described in much more detail. And it doesn't mean that it has to be so difficult that people cannot understand it, but it does take a lot of time to cover all of this. So the talk will be about, I'm estimating 90 minutes, and we'll take a break in between. And I want to encourage you to just kind of relax and don't get hung up on any one slide or any one quote if it's something you didn't catch, for a couple of reasons. One is that I'm going to go fairly fast through this. Two is that it's going to be videotaped, so you can watch it again later. And you can also take as many screenshots of these slides as you'd like to refer back to. And I don't think that you need to have a secondary education to understand what I'm going to say tonight. And I actually find that just about everybody understands most of what I say, even when I talk in medical terms. And I discovered this at a talk I did in Finland to a group of doctors, and one of the secretaries was there, and she said, you know, I didn't really understand the details of what you said, but I get it, and that makes a whole lot of sense to me. So even if you don't understand all the details, just try to get the big picture of what I'm talking about tonight, and know that your doctor probably doesn't understand any of this, and anyone that you're probably going to argue with will know very little of what I'm going to say. And I have seen more than one empowered mother run over a doctor that had not done their homework. So the keep it stupid principle enables the mainstream sound bites to define immunity in terms of what's written above. And then they overlay it with another picture, which is that if you're vaccinated, you'll be surrounded by a protective force field and can walk through life in a safe bubble. When parents vaccinate their baby, the minute that first needle comes out of the skin, the doctor, the nurse, and most parents just sigh and they relax and they believe that the bubble has already been placed around their baby, even if so-called protection requires several shots. Funnier still is that if you're traveling to a country that is deemed high risk, they say that you need a vaccine to stay in your bubble, even though most people in that country will have had no vaccine for the disease. And then back in your own home country, you'll hear people say, you can't skip any vaccines, you must vaccinate, and everyone must vaccinate, or herd immunity will break down, and then vaccines won't work. So it's funny how you can be persuaded to feel secure walking through a disease-ridden country, but not at home with an 85 to 95% vaccination rate. The ultimate irony is when people from an undeveloped country come to a developed country and they suddenly get targeted as a disease risk to the vaccinated. Even with its contradictions, the simple KISS message is very effective, and few but the well-read or observant will notice any flaws in it. So let's take a look at where the concept of herd immunity comes from. I'm using measles as an example tonight because the concept of herd immunity was first developed with measles. I have other examples at the end if anybody still has any energy of different diseases. Please note that this presentation and the concept of herd immunity only applies where measles has been circulating for centuries It doesn't apply when measles or any other infectious disease occurs in an isolated or what we call virgin population that has never experienced a disease before. That's different. Also, when the disease happens in wartime or refugee camps or military recruits, that's also a different situation. Those types of situations involve huge amounts of stress, which breaks down the immune system and will always result in more severe infections and deaths, not just from measles, but from meningitis and adenovirus and influenza and other diseases. So my conversation revolves primarily around general population records for the USA, the UK, Denmark, etc., where measles was well embedded and the infection and death trends were well studied, and confounders can be easily seen. The original studies on herd immunity came from America, where Dr. A.W. Hedrick studied the natural occurrence of measles while doing his specific analysis in 1929. He was able to show that outbreaks came and went in 2 to 3 year cycles, and that by the age of 15, 95% of all children had had measles. There have been various serologic or blood studies done since that time in various parts of the world where measles has been circulating and where record keeping started, which also show pre-vaccine immunity at a rate of 95 to 99% in people older than the age of 15. Now, fast forward 37 years to 1968, and the leading United States of America authority on measles, Dr. Sensor, reiterated what Dr. Hedrick saw in Baltimore, Maryland. From year to year, in roughly 2 to 3 year cycles, was a remarkably narrow range of fluctuation in the balance of susceptible children and immune people. Just prior to a major epidemic, the proportion of the population under the age of 15 that was susceptible ranged from around 45 to 50%. And then there would be an epidemic, and then that proportion would fall to the level of 30 to 35%. So during any epidemic, only about 15% of all those susceptible children got measles. And that's actually a really small part of the total childhood population. And whenever I find a school teacher that's 70 years old or older, I say to them, well, what was it like before the vaccine when measles was circulating? Did you find that your entire class was wiped out when this would come through? And they all say no. There would maybe be one child or two children that would be absent from school for a week, and then they would come back, okay? In 1967, Dr. Sensor stated that measles would be eradicated by the following year by giving 1 measles shot to susceptible children before school age. As we stated in our book, Dissolving Illusions, American measles vaccines were first licensed in 1963. They started out with a very patchy safety and effectiveness history, but the 2015 justification for the universal use of measles vaccines in children is the following. Prevent measles death, to decrease severity of measles in vaccinated people, to protect children and adults with cancer, to stop the spread of measles, to prevent subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, which is a terrible brain disease, and encephalitis, which is inflammation, to prevent secondary infections like pneumonia, and to protect young babies. So let's look at each one of these listed items, starting with death from measles. Most Western countries keep detailed records of deaths, even if they aren't easily accessed. Denmark, for instance, has a quite startling graph showing the declines in measles deaths. And as you can see, the black lines were the death rate, and we have a record from 1862 to 2012. And you can see that the death was coming down, coming down, coming down, coming down. And here's where the vaccine came in. You can see there's hardly any black left there whatsoever. And you can see that the incidence, the cases, rose markedly. And that's probably also, it's probably really more up here for cases because many cases don't get reported, at least in America. So, this was not a result of vaccination. It wasn't a result of antibiotics. It wasn't necessarily a result of the healthcare system, because you can see it was already coming down even before antibiotics were invented. This was a result of good nutrition, of transportation being improved, of refrigeration, clean water, and social programs that really made the biggest difference. And most other countries, Western countries, have graphs just like this, so we can tick death off as an excuse for vaccinating today. Here we have England and Wales. Here we have the death rate from measles, not the incidence rate, the death rate coming down. There's where the vaccine came in. And we have 50 color graphs on the website for Dissolving Illusions, and we have them in black and white in the book. And so we're criticized often for discussing death and not incidence or rates of disease of measles. But the first thing you're going to hear from your doctor or from a family member who wants you to vaccinate is that your baby could die. So when death suits them, it's used to manipulate you. And that's why parents need facts. But, says the doctor, even if your child doesn't die, the vaccine will decrease the severity of measles if the vaccinated get it. And that could save your vaccinated child. Because we're told measles is much more scary than Ebola, right? Well, that's actually wrong. Let's look at what one of the great minds of infectious disease, the so-called father of infectious disease epidemiology, who was very famous in America, Dr. Alexander Langmuir, had to say about measles in 1962. Uh-oh. That's not good. Let's see what's going on here. I might have to start this part over. Let's just pause for a second. I'm going to escape from here, find out what went wrong. Looks good here. View, presenter. Interesting. All right, I'm going to present this. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to present it like this for now so you can see it, and then we'll switch back to the other view. So, Dr. Alexander Langmuir I'll start this over. Dr. Alexander Langmuir had to say about measles. In 1962, he was asked, "Why do you wish to eradicate measles?" And he replied with the same answer that Sir Edmund Hillary used when asked why he wished to climb Mount Everest. He said, "Because it's there." And he added, "And it may be done." So he also described measles as a self-limiting infection of short duration, moderate severity, and low fatality that has maintained a remarkably stable biological balance over the centuries. And his contemporaries in England, isn't that interesting? And his contemporaries in England and Wales were equally laid back, saying that measles was considered to be a mild infection, rarely needing any medical treatment. This is some screenshots that I took from a very interesting article from the British Medical Journal. It was a group of doctors reporting through England and Wales about what their experience at ground zero really was in treating measles. And they said that it was the commonest disease in the world with very few complications. They'd probably die laughing if they heard in 2015 that measles is worse than hemorrhagic plague. And up here is the reference, which didn't come out very big. And you can go into PubMed Central and get it from there. They said that the use of saline mist placebo was handy. There were few complications. They did not attempt even to prevent the spread of measles. They did not use antibiotics and drugs because they seemed unnecessary. They described the best years to get it was between the ages of 3 and 7, and that it would be over in a week, and mothers were delighted at how much good measles had done for their children afterwards. So we can tick the severity argument off at least in terms of the people who were at ground zero when measles was as common as the common cold. Their next argument was that we need to protect children and adults with cancer. Why are people with cancer so prone to any disease? Partly because the drugs they're given incrementally kill vast numbers of cells in their bodies and dismantle all levels of the immune system from the inside out. The reality is that people with cancer can be easily as knocked over by something like yeast or the common cold or any bacteria. But one of the biggest risks in the United States to a cancer patient are what we call superbugs in the hospital, like Clostridium difficile or certain types of enterococcus or bowel bacteria that escape the drugs that are trying to kill them. And these are not a risk to healthier people. So for the medical system to primarily protect these people with vaccines is somewhat bizarre, but even as they do so, most hospitals will have some kind of notification, just like this, notification that I got from the Johns Hopkins Hospital, patient information, which alerts family and friends of patients that if they've recently been vaccinated with a live virus vaccine like chickenpox or measles, rubella, influenza, shingles, rotavirus, oral polio, with supposedly weakened and non-infectious viruses, as we're told, that they had better stay well away from these cancer patients. The reality is, though, that most cancer patients, if they want to survive, should stay away from crowds and society until such a time as their immune systems can cope with a simple cold. Next on the list was to stop the spread of measles. And certainly from 1963 in the United States, one injection was given to more than 55% of the susceptible children. And the vaccine did indeed interrupt the transmission of measles. Until 1978, when the cases started to creep up again. And by 1991, enough of the 25,000 cases were vaccinated to prompt a 2-dose measles, mumps, and rubella policy. A new problem was revealed in 1991 as well. Before the vaccine, it was rare for children under the age of 3 to get measles, and even more rare for children under the age of 2 to get it. And babies under 1 were almost always protected by strong transplacental maternal antibodies created by a mother who had had natural measles, solid immunity. Denmark didn't begin routine measles vaccinations until 1986. You guys started in 1969, and Finland in 1982. By 1991, the rate of measles in American babies under 1 had tripled. And the reason was that the first group of vaccinated girls were now of childbearing age. And vaccine immunity isn't the same as natural immunity. Maternal antibodies don't protect babies as well or as long as natural antibodies do. And this is very well established and well known in the medical literature, which is why potential mothers are told to revaccinate before they get pregnant if they're not immune. To summarize, because one shot wasn't working well enough in 1992, 2 shots were started. And in the 2015 outbreak in the United States, quite a number of the measles cases had received 2 MMR vaccines. So we appear to have a new problem today. In December 2014, the measles outbreak in Disneyland resulted in widespread hysteria and close monitoring of all cases. Did you hear about it here? Was it on your... Yes? I can't imagine it. Wasn't. An Alaskan baby became sick with a disease that looked like measles, walked like measles, talked like measles, and tested like measles. So everyone thought it was Disneyland measles, because that's where she had been sometime before. However, because she was vaccinated, they decided to test the genetic makeup of the measles strain, and they discovered that it was a vaccine virus. So they decided that the clinical disease was no longer measles, and the case would be struck from the record. The next case, which hit the headlines, was in Canada, where a girl had symptoms of measles, which on testing from a nose swab showed the vaccine measles virus. The article said that several children at the daycare had recently been vaccinated and were likely shedding viruses. This is quite ironic, given that we're always told that the MMR viruses are incapable of infecting anyone. Therefore, because the infection in front of them was only from a vaccine, in another brilliant stroke of illogic, they struck that case from the record. So measles is only reported as a measles case when you don't get it from the vaccine. 3 years before, in Eastern Europe, Dr. Kayak reported a curious case of measles in a toddler. Notice the fact that she became symptomatic 5 days after injection. And that's way too soon for a natural virus because it's an average of 14 days before the virus makes its way into the lungs and through the lymphatics and into the blood and then becomes symptomatic. They found vaccine strain virus and then wondered if she got it from another vaccinated child. But what's really interesting about this article is that they went on to say that had they not been actively looking for and testing anything that looked like measles, that this case would have been either misreported as rubella or not recognized at all. And the point of this is that normally cases like these fall through the cracks because vaccinated kids don't get measles, right? But Croatia wasn't the only country doing enhanced surveillance. 3 years later, Canada was on alert and came up with an even more interesting case of a vaccinated 2-year-old who came down with measles symptoms 37 days after vaccination, which is way too long in terms of the incubation time. So they decided to type that virus because it was abnormal, and sure enough, vaccine strain virus. Canadian authorities promptly panicked and vaccinated all of this baby's contacts and treated 4 of them with pooled immunoglobulin. They plainly didn't consider the vaccine virus as a mild virus to be ignored. And again, it was only because of heightened surveillance and awareness of measles that this case was noticed and identified as vaccine-induced. Another interesting case occurred in a 1-year-old child whose mother was HIV positive, and his HIV status at the time of his vaccination and his vaccine strain measles infection was indeterminate. This is a clear case of the measles vaccine endangering the vulnerable. As a side note, I need to comment on the number of parents who have come to me in the past few years with babies whose immune systems are clearly not right, and yet hospital pediatricians and immunologists don't think to do basic immune system tests to see what state that baby's immune system is in. The case above is another example of a child whose doctors should have been on top of the situation and withheld a live virus vaccine until his HIV status was determined. Remember the man in the little bubble on the second slide? Our next case illustrates just how incorrect this bubble mentality is. The index case was a twice vaccinated theater usher who got measles. There were 88 contacts, and 4 of those got clinical measles, even though they were supposedly immune because they had had 2 vaccines or the blood antibodies showed that they were immune. But they got full-blown clinical measles anyway. How? Because their immunity was only measured by vaccination and antibody, and that is not a good measure of measles immunity. You need a good cell-mediated immune system to fight measles, and not just antibodies. So clearly, there was a breach in those people's immunity. This type of thing didn't happen in the pre-vaccine era. There's an old saying that if you don't look for something, you won't find it. And we need to ask an unanswerable question. How many cases of measles in decades past were due to vaccine infections? Answer, no one knows, because no one looked, and the dogma says it just doesn't happen. There's another area which is also full of assumptions and lack of knowledge, and that's the myth that serious complications like SSPE can happen to anyone. And for that reason, vaccination is the way to go. I'm not going to get into SSPE because there's no data on SSPE before the vaccine era, and it's a very difficult subject to discuss. It primarily happened in children who got measles under the age of 2, which indicates a specific immune susceptibility that's also related to age. The measles vaccine has been touted as stopping encephalitis. So the question that needs to be asked is, did it? The pro-vaccines say that measles encephalopathy presents in otherwise healthy children in significant numbers. They say that we can never know who will get encephalitis, which is brain inflammation, and that vaccination will prevent this problem. If the measles vaccine can eliminate encephalopathy, that should reduce the total numbers in a very short period of time, because a big chunk of the pie will be taken out. Did that happen after measles vaccine? In 1989, a Finnish researcher named Dr. Koskaniemi said that total encephalitis cases declined, as seen in this table, which looks at the years 1968 through 1987. And in Finland, the measles vaccine started in 1982. And immediately, there was an 85% vaccine uptake. So it's true that specific wild measles-related encephalitis did decline after the vaccine interrupted wild measles in countries that vaccinated heavily, at least for a while. But the bigger picture shows a pattern that really should be noted. I'll get to it in a minute. Dr. Koskaniemi said that while the total cases declined in the 5 years, as you can see when we take the average before, it was 10.4 cases per 100,000 infections, and after the vaccine down to 3.6 per 100,000. But he said the severity had increased in those people who did get encephalitis. Have a read of this while I have a drink. What Dr. Koskaniemi saw was that the decrease in total numbers of encephalitis was not accompanied by a decrease in the proportion of severe cases, but the proportion of severe cases had actually increased. Here is the table showing the increase in poor outcome cases from 7.2 average pre-vaccine in the red brackets to 17.1 post-vaccine in the blue bracket. Case histories prove victims of infectious encephalopathy usually have an immune system problem, which leaves them susceptible to any kind of pathogen that has that potential. So all you see in Koskaniemi's studies is encephalitis remaining, but other pathogens taking the place of measles. Nature abhors a vacuum. In any microbial environment, if you remove one occupant, another will take its place, as we see with all invasive disease pathogens, which can cause encephalitis. 8 years later, in a follow-up report, Dr. Koskaniemi noted that the encephalitis rate had actually returned to the same level as pre-vaccine. We were now up to 10.2 cases per 100,000. I remember before it was 10.4 cases per 100,000. And he was measuring between January 1993 and December 1994 when he got this 10.2 rate. So Dr. Koskaniemi said, the spectrum of encephalitis in children has changed due to vaccination programs. The incidence, however, appears to be about the same due to increasing frequency of other associated old and new microbes. Dr. Koskaniemi analyzed the microbes that moved into children. One of the cases of encephalitis was vaccine-associated. Other, here, this piece of pie is what's represented in blue here. And the other pieces, the abbreviations stand for varicella, respiratory diseases, enterovirus, adenovirus, HSV, rotavirus, chlamydia, and other unknown. And look at how many of them are unknown. So while MMR initially reduced the total numbers of encephalitis, it did nothing to decrease serious encephalitis, and the numbers came back up again. because encephalitis is a disease of susceptibility, not necessarily of a microbe. I also believe that a similar situation exists with regard to secondary infections. Why is it that the majority of measles cases never get secondary infections? What makes those who do different? As I mentioned before, there's a reason why people get disease complications like encephalitis. This also applies to secondary infections. There's also a reason why vaccine immunity isn't the same as natural immunity. So we need to have an idea why this is. This 2012 textbook makes it clear that cell-mediated immunity is crucial for measles survival and for battling secondary infections. And what this describes, we also describe in our book, talks about how if you have a disease called A-gamma globulinemia, where you don't make antibodies, you can get measles and you will recover from measles just like anyone else, and you will have long-term memory immunity to measles. Note that word iatrogenic T cell deficiency that they talk about. That means caused by a treatment given by a doctor. The key to no complications is that your child's innate immune system works properly. And what can toss a bomb into that besides doctors? Poor nutrition for a start. In 2007, a website called the Measles Initiative had a page on their website. This is a screenshot taken by what's called the Wayback Machine, where you can get screenshots of old pages that were visited in the past, even if they don't exist anymore. The original page was written in 2006. I have the original, but I've not been able to find this on their website lately. In places like Africa, where nutritional deficiencies are portrayed with graphic intensity, their immune systems have major breaches, directly caused by their living conditions and serious malnutrition. We know that these children are usually very vitamin A deficient, with other problems we can see with the naked eye, like the swollen bellies that come from having serious protein deficiency. Where the immune systems can't control and contain measles viruses, you have huge viral loads, out of control disease, and a really nasty situation. But the social and nutritional reasons for the sort of death rates the Measles Initiative talks about had been largely dealt with in Scandinavia before you even used vaccines. And that's one reason why deaths were so low. That situation hasn't existed in the Western world for over 100 years. Yes, in Western countries, measles can still be dangerous. In some places like ghettos in the USA and the classic slums in Glasgow, Scotland, there will always be places where children's immune systems are not working well because of the social situation they live in. Good nutrition is crucial to preventing secondary infections and deaths everywhere in the world. You've seen how and why your death rates to measles dropped. And that had everything to do with improved nutrition and improved living conditions, which helped the immune systems work better before vaccines for measles were even introduced. In the third world, children suffer horrible malnutrition because they just don't have enough food. But what I see in America is something I call nutritional information poverty, where parents feed their children plenty of white bread, margarine, cakes, biscuits, donuts, Coca-Cola, and even diet soda drinks. It's not protein calorie malnutrition. It's empty or toxic calorie nutrition, which also has a huge impact on the immune system. Ironically, this has actually become very common in the middle and upper classes in America. Bad nutrition creates not just obesity, but a whole different set of immune system problems than those that were seen in Africa. And they can have similar results with susceptibility and manifestation of disease. So let's do a quick review at how the immune system works in a stepwise progression to deal with illnesses. And I know some people saw this a few nights ago, but as far as I'm concerned, you can never see this enough because each time might get into you a little deeper as well. So a person's first experience with a natural infection usually happens through one of the linings, the nose, throat, lungs, or gut. And most diseases have a period of days and sometimes weeks before people even seem sick and then recover. Most microbes we're met with never make us sick at all. even though they have full capacity to kill us under certain circumstances. Why is this? It has to do with the effectiveness of every level represented in this picture. So in the first block, what we have is I'm just showing, these are the barriers. So this would say be a mucous membrane that would have a layer of mucus and some healthy, beneficial bacteria called probiotics, which we actually have on our skin and our throats. The microbiome, as it's called, can either be healthy or diseased. And if it's healthy, the microbes that don't belong there are going to be, there'll be competition for the nutrients and food sources and the pH. And this will stay perfectly fine. So this is part of it, is having normal flora, okay? Then we have local chemical factors that you may not be aware of. It's actually pretty amazing when you read about it, but our skin secretes antibiotics. Your gut actually secretes proteins that are toxic to certain microbes. And then we have these cells called phagocytes, which aren't memory cells. They're just always there. You're born with them. And any invader that comes into the lung, say if you're a smoker, you're going to have a lot of these hanging out in your lung, trying to clean up and eat things that don't belong there. So this is the first layer of defense that's pretty much working most of the time. And you can see that, you know, these cells that sample, they're just able to rest because nothing's getting through. Okay, and this is a blood vessel. Then you have the second layer. And this is where you can get maybe local infection, penetration. This can happen in the gut, say if you have an ulcer in the gut, or it can happen on the skin, or the throat, or the lungs, where this barrier, you know, you have bronchitis, you can have some breakdown of the barrier here. And bacteria that normally stay out can get in. And this is what happens when there's inflammation. So you'll have a little bit of heat production at the site, or at the skin, or even in the intestine. And then again, those proteins and peptides will come through, your munch 'em up cells will come through, and a chemical called complement can also help destroy invading microorganisms. And then you can be done with this, heal and go back to here, okay? Or you can end up in this state here. If this progresses and you don't go that way, you'll go this way. And that's when you'll start to have a fever in the whole body with chemicals that are telling the brain we want to raise the temperature, and that temperature will actually start to kill off bacteria and viruses, and then you'll start having more of these chemicals, more macrophages, and more activity here. And over here, this is called the adaptive immunity. This is where a vaccine starts, okay? It starts right over here. And so if you don't go that way at this point, you're going to go this way. And that's when you're going to have prolonged fevers, you're going to have more of the deeper immune cells activated, going back to where they're made and telling them to make more clones that can go to battle. And then you're going to either die or you're going to live. And most of us live. So that's just a basic review of the levels of protection that you have. The oldest plague of sailors, called scurvy, is vitamin C deficiency at its very worst. But even today, I see people with the bright red gums and other signs and symptoms of vitamin C deficiency everywhere I go. I've even seen people in Oslo with this. These people are sitting ducks for illness and bad outcomes because vitamin C is crucial to every step I just described here. And I just want to point something else out, and that is that when you have, say, a measles infection where you're working on all of these levels right here, you're having an enormous rate of turnover, of cell death on all the mucous membranes, on the skin and everywhere. Now, if you don't have vitamin C, these macrophage cells that go in and clean up everything that's dead and get rid of it, they're not going to work. So all this debris that needs to go is going to sit there and you're just going to rot. So vitamin C isn't just important for doing all of the activity here and for reestablishing these layers of tissue. It basically makes the cement that holds the cells together. It's important for the fuel in the mitochondria and in these cells to work properly and to rebuild this layer out here. Vitamin C is required for every step here. So the CDC now says that there were the Centers for Disease Control in America says that there were 500,000 yearly reported measles cases in the United States. There were actually 3 to 4 million yearly total cases, which means that most cases were not severe enough to even go to a doctor back then. let's look at how the natural measles, the kind that used to circulate before vaccines, worked its way slowly through the body over an incubation period of 14 days. And during this time, the spread of measles is contained and limited by its need for different receptors to enter different compartments of the body. The virus enters, you breathe it in here, and then the first thing it hits are the lung surface cells. And that there are these cells in the lung, these macrophages, specialized lung macrophages that have a receptor called CD150 or SLAM. And the virus can only enter into those cells. And then after a while, you'll have multiplication around there, and then those cells will bring it to what's called the regional lymph nodes. So they're all, so you see the throat, the arms, and then you can see the body's turning a little more purple, and that's really just denoting that it's gotten into the blood a little more. And here it's even more into the blood, and now it takes it to the other, what are called lymphoid organs, such as the spleen, the thymus, appendix, tonsils, lymph nodes. And then it has to use another receptor to go into the other side. This is what this is showing, to get back out through the lungs and through the skin, and then you're going to get a rash, and you're going to start coughing, and that's when you can spread it. So notice, it's a stepwise process for you to become infected with natural measles, and you need at least 2 receptors, probably 3 or 4, but they're still discovering them at this point. All the time that the natural measles virus is driving deeper into the body, those frontline defenses that I showed you here are still going. Okay, so I'm showing you this now, but this is all still going. We're cleaning up dead cells. We are still needing to do all these layers under the skin as well. And that's in order to control the spread of disease in the body and to mop up all of the debris that has been created. And you can see how the 3 layers shown here are very important. And this is just another way to look at those 4 frames that I showed you before. So here we have the innate immunity, which is called in within 0 to 4 hours. So that's what's sitting on your skin or in your throat or your intestines. And so you can get this infection, it can be recognized and just gotten rid of, just like that. Or you can have a response that takes a little longer, 4 to 96 hours, and then you start recruiting some of those what are called effector, kind of worker cells. And they recognize different codes that are common to many pathogens and damage in the body. And then they start calling in the troops, and then you can just be done with it. And then you can have what's called adaptive immune response, and that's what a vaccine goes for. None of this matters to vaccinologists, only this matters. And so what happens, this is the part after you've breathed it in, where it's transported to the lymph organs, and then it's recognized by your B and T cells in those different organs, and that's telling them to make more clones to go to battle. And that's what's happening here. And then you recover. So over here is 2 very important parts. This is called TH1, and you're going to hear this. If you keep reading on this, you're going to hear TH1 and TH2 over and over and over. And it's a vast oversimplification of immunity, but it's very important to distinguish. TH1 is the cell-mediated arm of immunity that involves mostly those T cells. TH2 also involves cells, but they're more plasma cells and B cells, but it's mostly, its job is to make antibody. And any sickness and any vaccine can make one happen more than the other, but ideally, in most situations in health, you'll have a balance of both. And I showed you here, this is where a vaccine starts, and this is where a natural infection starts. So a child needs to have these first 2 layers working really well because they control and slow down viral multiplication and speed of access into the body. The first 2 layers and the cell-mediated immune response in the 3rd layer are key to both efficient control and clearance of the virus. As noted before, children with no ability to make this Th2 antibody get through measles just fine if the first 2.5 layers are working properly. And what's more, they do have long-term immunity. researchers were surprised to find that they don't get measles again. If anything goes wrong in these first 2.5 layers, then your child is in big trouble. We hear a lot about what can go wrong with measles disease, but the medical system hasn't had any real appreciation for those 3 layers above because their focus revolved around lots and lots of antibodies. The reason these 3 layers are important to understand when it comes to the measles vaccine is because the vaccine enters the body in a totally different way. First, the vaccine is not inhaled, and instead of following the same sequence as the disease that I described and gradually allowing stepwise, body-wise access starting at the lung surface, the vaccine goes past those physical barriers and defenses, and it uses a different receptor called CD46, which allows access to every nucleated cell in the body all at once. Which cells don't have nuclei? Only cells that don't are mature red blood cells, okay? Because the vaccine bypasses the first 2 layers of immune defense, you can have a recipe for disaster if that vaccine is not highly attenuated or what we call weakened. And that's exactly what happened with the first live measles vaccines in America. They weren't attenuated, and they created serious illness in people who were vaccinated. And they weren't called measles cases, by the way. And really, that's all the vaccine is. And this is well admitted to in the medical literature, is that a vaccine, especially for measles, a live vaccine, is an injected case of the disease, a controlled injected case of the disease. So you're not getting a vaccine to escape the disease, you're getting a controlled case of injected measles with a biologically, genetically altered virus as a result of its culturing on monkey kidney cells way back. Doctors were afraid to give these original vaccines without also injecting gamma globulin to stop the serious systemic disease symptoms that resulted from instant access to the whole body. It also gave a poor vaccine response when they gave those things together. In 1965, they had no idea that the vaccine cell cultures had led to a mutation which changed the entrance capacity of that vaccine virus. All they saw was that people were getting serious measles after becoming vaccinated. Changing an immune response can also have a parallel in disease. The treatment of measles is equally as important. Just as doctors didn't understand why the first vaccines caused serious disease, they sometimes don't realize what they can do to make disease worse. The medical profession have also contributed to more than a few deaths and complications because of how they used to treat measles. In the early days of measles, standard treatment created big problems. This can be seen by looking at this doctor's response to what was then considered gold standard practice in hospitals in the 1960s. Dr. Witzenberg went to Ghana and was appalled at what he saw. In his view, the treatment of measles was medical malpractice, and he said so. He wanted to change the way the hospital did things. Even though his colleagues thought he was a crazy quack, they did allow him to do an experiment. And you know those crazy quacks who respect the natural processes of the body and don't want to suppress fevers or give drugs and antibiotics. That's what they thought of him. The article that I have up here was originally in German, but later translated into English and published in the Journal of Anthroposophic Medicine. You can actually still read this online, I believe. His study serves as a case in point, whether you're looking at malnourished populations or healthy ones. The practice at the time was to treat all children with antipyretics, or like paracetamol or ibuprofen, although I don't think ibuprofen existed, it was probably aspirin, antihistamines, antitussives, which are things that stop you from coughing, and sedatives. Bear in mind that they knew nothing about innate immunity back then. The gold standard treatment resulted in 35% of infected children dying. About halfway through a large epidemic, Dr. Witzenberg was allowed to do a controlled trial. all drugs were stopped in half of the children. There were 56 children in each group. And then one half where the drugs were stopped were just treated with bed rest, fluids, and as good of a diet as possible. The children who were treated with Wittenberg's protocol had a mortality rate of 7% compared to 35%. Even then, Dr. Wittenberg's colleagues were not convinced, and they said that he had just been lucky. But how would you explain the continued 35% death rate in the children treated with drugs? Was that also just bad luck? It's a very amusing article to read because he talks about how tense things got between him and this other doctor. The reason I'm bringing this up is that the concept of herd immunity is pushed very hard on the basis of death and complication statistics, which could be as high as they are because of what doctors were doing when parents took their seriously ill children to them. Another piece of history most parents don't know is that doctors used to treat measles by taking 25 mLs of blood from one of the parents and injecting half of that into each buttock of the sick child. Needless to say, this also contributed to children dying and becoming very, very sick. It was quietly abandoned in the late 1930s, but you can still read about it in selective, I've got a French journal, and I believe I've also got a German one that discusses this practice. But it was also done in America. Doctors today think all those deaths were caused by measles. All those deaths caused by doctors are part of the records which are used to create fear of measles in parents today. The death rates would not have been as high if doctors had not used unnecessary drugs and blood. If the death rate had been reduced by common sense and good nutrition and health, the argument for vaccines couldn't be pushed today the way that it is. There's no doubt that the measles vaccine creates antibodies in some people, and that the vaccine gives temporary immunity to most people. I'm not going to even argue that because I believe that this is absolutely true. And believe it or not, before vaccines in our countries, death rates had declined by over 98% and were developing durable individual immunity because of improved immune system functioning. Every 3 years, measles outbreaks infected 15% of susceptible children, but the population as a whole had high levels of community immunity. Until the vaccine came along and created new problems. As Dr. Sensor said in an earlier slide, mankind was learning to live in symbiosis with the virus, natural exposure to which not only conferred permanent immunity to measles itself, but may help prime the immune system of children to protect against other diseases. We can see in this graph a picture of what evolving natural herd immunity actually looks like. What we have here is the measles incidence, the case rates, starting at 1912 through 1997. The dotted line is the death to case ratio. So you can see that even before the vaccine came down, death to case ratio was declining, declining, declining. Here comes the vaccine, and look, we've got a little blip in there. Well, I won't comment on that, but what we can see here is that in 1982 and in 1992, we had two little blips. And those are indicative of leaks in the herd immunity created by vaccines, which were accompanied by a much higher case to death ratio than occurred in the past. Obviously, the pro-vaccine will say, but look at the case decrease. Is that not worth it? And that depends really on what your big picture is. Before the vaccine, naturally immune mothers gave their babies strong and longer-lasting immunity. And there's your reference. Children mainly got measles between the ages of 3 and 11, and at least 95% of adolescents were immune by age 15. Some records say 99% of adults were immune. Naturally immune adults did not get measles again. And we know this from the famous study on the Faroe Islands, where measles had a high attack rate, Initially, it was a virgin population. There was a 25% death rate. But then when measles came back again 65 years later, where it wasn't circulating, they found that the people that had had it the first time around didn't get it again. This graph proves that babies born to naturally immune mothers had longer lasting protection. And again, there's the reference. And what they're showing here on the right, these are babies that are that come from mothers. The mothers were born before 1957. So the mothers were born at a time when measles was freely circulating and they were getting constantly re-exposed as children and as teenagers before they became pregnant. And you can see that this is the percent of babies that were susceptible to measles infection. And you can see that I marked this because this is the 50% rate. So 50% of babies were still protected at 6 months back then, and protection lasted as long as up to 15 months back then. In the middle, these are the mothers that were born between 1958 and 1961. So while they might not have been vaccinated, they weren't exposed to the ongoing circulation. So you can see that their immunity levels were lower. And then here we have the 1963 and later group. So these are mothers that would be vaccinated, more than likely vaccinated, unless they got measles when they were very young babies. And they were not living at a time when the virus was circulating. And so they have the lowest level of immunity at all. And at 4 months, only 50% of those babies still have immunity. Now, I'm about halfway through, and if you wanted to have a break now, we could, or I could keep going. It's up to you. Keep going. Everyone agree to keep going? Maybe another 10, 15 minutes? Okay. It's hard to find a break spot in this particular talk for whatever reason. So, before the vaccine, reported measles cases didn't reflect how much measles was in the country. I already talked about that. Even the Centers for Disease Control, this is on their website today, says that 4 million annual cases of measles must have occurred in order for their blood surveys showing that 95% plus immunity, which means that most measles cases in America were so mild that they never got reported. Only 1/8 got reported. Today, we have a situation where adolescents and adults are the biggest group who get measles because their vaccine immunity is 23.2 times lower than those induced by natural infection. And there's your reference for that. Which includes maternal immunity, so that by 1991, babies were 3 times more vulnerable than they were before the vaccines. The attack rate today could be even higher. Dr. Papania, who quoted that in his paper, only looked at naturally immune mothers in the post-vaccine era, and he underestimated what the protection rate would have been pre-vaccine, as I just showed you on that curve, that it's very different. So he was looking pretty much in that middle section. Dr. Peter Orby has pointed out the same trend in Africa, where by 2003, and they were vaccinating heavily by 2003 in Africa, he said measles was infecting young adults and would infect pregnant women with the worst forms of measles. And he said what makes the situation worse is that in the early days of the vaccine's use, immunity was regularly boosted by still circulating wild measles virus, which artificially inflated the efficacy of the vaccine. By stopping the virus circulating, the presumed protection of the vaccine is no longer as high as they once thought it was. So in other words, in the beginning, when there was still circulating virus and they were vaccinating, it looked like the things were going pretty well, because at that point, you had all those people in society who were naturally immune for life, and you had vaccinated people who were freshly vaccinated, and you had them getting boosted by natural viruses circulating. And then that's changed. Of course, now we're having those people who are naturally immune are dying off, and we have the stoppage of the amount of circulation that we used to have, and we have vaccines wearing off as well. This fact has been carefully analyzed several times by medical researchers who predict that because of shaky vaccine immunity, our future might be somewhat spotty. The analyses of these authors predicted that in 20 to 30 years' time, herd immunity will be so fragile that should measles come through again, we'll be worse off than we would have been had they not introduced the vaccine. Levy said that by 2050, the number of susceptibles will be higher than pre-vaccine times. He discussed his predictions based on a one-dose vaccine model, which was the model at the time that he wrote the paper. And this is just kind of the details of how he worked out his figures. So what about today's two-dose model? Well, Dr. Heffernan did an analysis, and he didn't really think all that much of that. He said that the dynamic consequences of the interaction between vaccination, waning immunity, and boosting are far more striking. For high levels of vaccination, greater than 80%, and moderate levels of waning immunity, greater than 30 years, large-scale epidemic cycles can be induced. And that's pretty much us. And his prediction was that a long disease-free period could be followed by a far larger epidemic than predicted, starting about 52 years after the vaccination programs began. Considering that vaccination only really got underway with an effective vaccine in 1980, as this writer described, counting 52 years from there, the year 2032 is a good estimated guess of when more surges of measles cases will become obvious, at least in America. Another medical article put it this way, that 20 years after 2 doses of vaccine have been given, 33 to 44% of those recipients would become susceptible to measles again. The old pre-vaccine community immunity of 95 to 99% for life is out the window. What we see here, this is the main analysis, and these are what are called confidence intervals, meaning kind of the range of where we could end up. So what we have over here are the I have to come over here and look at this. Potentially susceptible people, okay? And this is based on blood testing, on antibody testing, actually. And this is how many years after people were vaccinated. So you can see over here, if we go to 20 years out and just go to the middle, we're looking at approximately 33% of people being susceptible when we look at the middle line. But if we look at the other line, we're up to about 44%. And you can see that over time, a certain percentage of the population, after 15 years, you're still having about 12 or 13% of people that were vaccinated with 2 doses not having immunity. We know that, and the experts know this. For this reason, their answer will be more of the same, which is to give extra vaccines earlier to babies, again to pre-pregnant women, more to us adults who were vaccinated as children, and to make vaccines mandatory by law for everyone from cradle to grave. They are also researching newer vaccines that maybe can be inhaled and given earlier, closer to the time of birth. What could have been done differently? That's the question. Well, back then they could have reevaluated the treatment methods which made measles death more likely and stopped doing those things. They could have looked at things like Dr. Witzenberg looked at. I mean, imagine if not only had he stopped the drugs, but had he been given vitamin A and vitamin C and support like that. They could have studied the disease properly and found ways to effectively support the cellular immune system, we now know a lot about that, to control and get rid of the virus efficiently. Now, we have to protect young babies and the vulnerable with vaccination. Are these the only vulnerable groups? Babies below 15 months are not vaccinated in many countries, but the use of daycare has become commonplace, at least in America. So they're unvaccinated and not protected by their mother's antibodies. And then they're exposed to older, vaccinated, virus-shedding kids. We know that in daycare centers, we've measured this, that even if a child is happy in a daycare center, their cortisol level is much higher than a baby or a toddler that's not there. And that makes them more susceptible to disease as well. We also know from other studies that when someone has measles and they're in a population where there's been a lot of mixing of bacteria and viruses, that the chances of secondary infections are actually much higher. And a daycare center is the perfect storm for that to happen. Or how about the child whose vaccine really never had any effect at all? That's called primary vaccine failure. And this is known to happen between 2 and 10% of the time in people who have had 2 vaccines. Or how about the child whose vaccine wears off very fast? That child is called a secondary vaccine failure. And this happens in about 19% of vaccinated, 4 to 11 years after the second shot. Do you think people have a false sense of security from their measles vaccines? It sure looks like they do. Especially when you see the numbers of vaccinated that are contracting measles today. Last year in California, most of the cases were in people who lived during the time when little virus was circulating. And look at how many less than 4-year-olds and over 20-year-olds were infected in that California outbreak. Here we have over 20 years old, 56% of all that were infected. That would have never happened back in 1950. Look at the less than 1-year-olds, 11%. Back in 1950, that would have been like less than 1%. And then 1 to 4-year-olds, 15%. And this is the group that actually would handle it the easiest. Only 18% of them got infected. So you can see the vaccine has definitely had an effect. And this is what happens today when the vaccine re-enters the population. But this didn't happen before vaccines because 95 to 99% of those people in this age group here, and part of them in here, had evidence of immunity by age 15. And because these mothers were passing good, solid immunity onto those babies. But we can see that these sorts of situations are happening everywhere at a point where the world has the highest ever MMR uptake in history today. This is World Health Organization data collection showing huge case rates in the Western Pacific region, which has a very high rate of vaccination. The flaws in the herd immunity theory are starting to become obvious, and they're going to have to consider what should we do to hold back the leaks. And when we come back, we'll talk more about that. All right, ready to go again. So we were talking about the leaks that have occurred since the beginning. In the beginning, we had a round of vaccines to part of the childhood population, which appeared to cull back the spread of measles. And then we had our first series of leaks in the 1980s, 1990s, when we realized that there were a bunch of those children who were vaccinated who the vaccine didn't take. They were either primary failures or secondary vaccine failures. And so we changed to a 2-dose regimen. And ever since then, we've been increasing the rate that we're told is required for herd immunity. We go from 85% to 90 to 95, and we're up to 99% requirement, so we're told. So what are we going to do to hold back these leaks? Let's have a look at the evolution of the vaccine schedule. I just reviewed some of it. In 1963, in America, we had a killed and a live attenuated vaccine. This killed vaccine, by the way, was a major problem. And even though it was causing big problems, it wasn't removed from the market. Actually, they just stopped producing it until around 1967. About 1.5 million doses was given. And if you had this killed vaccine, you could have had something called antibody-dependent enhancement, which meant that if you were encountering a circulating virus or you got one of these vaccines, that you would get a case of measles that was far worse than anything that was the regular kind of measles that was circulating. And then we had these live attenuated vaccines, which means that they made an effort to make them less infectious, but it wasn't a very strong effort. And these were the ones that had to be given with that immune globulin. And then in 1965, they attenuated it even more, meaning they selected out the strains that had mutated that wouldn't cause as much of an infection or that would die more easily under the pressure of heat or fever. Then in 1967, I said that killed vaccine was withdrawn, taken off the market, not until millions were given. 1968, they finally got a more further attenuated vaccine, meaning one that they could administer without immunoglobulin. But by this point, doctors were pretty scared, and in the beginning, they weren't willing to give it without the immunoglobulin. And unfortunately, that meant that it really wasn't going to be very effective. By 1971, we began this measles, mumps, and rubella, so it was a 3-in-1 vaccine. And in 1989, in America, we started the 2-dose schedule because of the leaks that I just talked about. And then in 2005, we had a new vaccine that was added varicella and was created on aborted fetal tissue called MRC cells, I think is what they're called. And today, we have a resurgence, even though our rates of uptake are above 90%, which is much higher vaccination rate than when annual measles cases were much lower than now. So we can see here in 1982 and in 1991 where we had those leaks. And if they continued those graphs, you would have seen a couple more leaks in 2014 and 2015. We're seeing this rise in cases because all the older people who had solid lifelong immunity from the disease are dying off, and at least 10% of the vaccinated people today will have no immunity from their vaccine 7 years later. So what was once solid adult community immunity has become a bit of a leaky sieve. When you see these leaks getting bigger and bigger, you and I will be blamed, or refugee immigrants, but never ever the vaccine's known failures are mentioned. We can already see the goalposts being shifted with demands of higher rates of vaccination than previously. What they don't appreciate is what famed vaccinologist, he comes next, Dr. Gregory Poland, has clearly said, that because the current vaccine has such shortcomings, you will never reach a level of 95% community immunity, even if 100% of people were to be vaccinated. Dr. Poland admits to that because his right hand is sitting on some patents for a new generation of measles vaccines that will hopefully, in his hope, be released in the future. And you can see here Dr. Majumdar talked about, given the highly contagious nature of measles, vaccination rates of 96 to 99% are required to preserve herd immunity. And this is in 2015. So we're going up. We don't have much farther to go, folks. So I repeat, the current MMR vaccine is not capable of eradicating measles. Dr. Gregory Poland has said so on several occasions. Multiple studies demonstrate that 2 to 10% of those immunized with 2 doses of measles vaccine fail to develop protective antibody levels, and that immunity can wane over time and result in infection, so-called secondary vaccine failure, when the individual is exposed to measles. Our current tool for prevention has limitations that increasingly look to be significant enough that sustained elimination, much less eradication, are unlikely. Perhaps it's time to consider in earnest the development of the next generation of measles vaccines, and conveniently he happens to be the fellow that's working on this. And this is proven by China, which has a 99% vaccination rate and does not allow exemptions. China has huge numbers of primary and secondary vaccine failure. And whenever I use this example, people say, oh, but the Chinese people are very overcrowded and they live on top of one another. And I say, how many excuses do you want to use to avoid answering the question, does the vaccine give protective immunity or doesn't it? So look at China. There were over 107,000 case notifications in 2014, of which 50,000 of them were confirmed. Now that doesn't mean the rest weren't measles, it just means that they weren't confirmed. So will they say that herd immunity needs 110% vaccination rate in 2016? The Chinese know that the measles rates are rising despite the highest possible coverage. And they're seeing the same trends in babies and older children as we are in America and in adults. And it says here that in spite of high measles vaccination coverage, measles incidence rates have been rising in China over the last decade. In addition, there has been a shift in peak age of measles cases from young children to adolescents and younger adults, exactly what we saw in California. They also know there may be another reason for these huge numbers of cases, which is vaccine escape mutants. This is a very controversial subject matter, and I am told by people who don't like me very much that this is a completely preposterous idea. So I went to the medical literature and I read every paper that's available on this subject matter. And my determination is that it is not preposterous at all, and that the Chinese literature shows that it's actually happening in this mutant strain L397. And this has nothing to do with primary or secondary vaccine failure. The virus is now outsmarting the kind of immunity that vaccine puts into the blood of the vaccinated person. And in order to understand why, new research is finally looking at just what sort of immunity the vaccines give. And what they found is that there's a big difference between the ability of a naturally immune person and a vaccinated person's blood to fight different strains of wild and vaccine strains. There were two different groups that were looked at: naturally immune mothers from Nigeria and 12-year-old vaccinated children from Luxembourg, and they should still have pretty strong immunity from their vaccine at that age. The vaccinated children showed an inferior ability to neutralize virus compared to the naturally immune. The researchers do not discuss why. In my opinion, the reason this happens is because the different receptors and layers of the immune system that the wild virus goes through gives a much broader, more complete protection, which recognizes and fights off all measles very efficiently. And vaccine immunity does not. Although both cohorts were matched, 12 of the 22 late convalescent sera, those are the ones who actually had measles disease, and only 6 of the 24 vaccinated Luxembourg children were able to neutralize all the viruses that they were exposed to. Similarly, only 2 of 20 viruses were not neutralized by at least 75% of the naturally immune, in comparison to 10 of 20 viruses that resisted neutralization by at least 75% of the vaccinees. So clearly there's a huge difference in the ability to fight different strains of measles, whether you're vaccinated or whether you're naturally immune. In this Chinese study, Dr. Shi again was looking at the genetic variation of 16 wild-type measles virus strains that infected 14 vaccinated people and 2 non-vaccinated people. He found that the vaccinated were susceptible to a mutated wild-type measles virus infection. And no doubt the pro-vaccine would blame the unvaccinated for not stopping the circulation, but you could hardly do that given that the hallmark of the measles vaccine has always been that it would cover every strain and every possible mutation. They always said that the measles virus is different, that there's something in it that's so consistent that it will always stay covered by the vaccine. But China's about as thoroughly vaccinated as you can get, and many of those mutations have actually arisen in China, which has the highest vaccination rates. And in my opinion, that's because what we're seeing in China is an accelerated version of what we're about to see in the United States and what we'll probably see in Scandinavia at some point years later. The reason being is that China has a heavily vaccinated, highly populated area, so we're able to see the dynamics much more fast and clearly. but I believe we're also starting to see them in America. But no one is answering the question. All they're saying is that it's time for a second golden egg era for a new measles vaccine. Dr. Shi here, after he talks about all the mutants, this special strain that he found, basically says that we need new measles vaccines as a surrogate strategy to achieve global measles eradication. Moreover, the second golden age, we keep hearing this golden age. Dr. Poland talked about the golden age for measles vaccine may provide us new insight for measles vaccine development. So, it's really interesting to me that even when it comes to the influenza vaccines or comes to finding new adjuvants or something like aluminium as an adjuvant, we're never allowed to say anything negative in the medical literature. However, when there's something new in the pipeline, that's when it's time to start rubbishing the old way. And that's exactly what we're seeing here, is that now that we have these new vaccines that are about to hit the market, everyone's allowed to talk bad about the old ones. Which leads me back to a comment by Dr. Peter Orby, which was when vaccines were started, lifelong vaccine immunity was assumed because they knew nothing about the layers of the immune system or how measles progressed through the body. They thought that sticking a needle in the body would be just as good as natural immunity. And Dr. Orby said it has usually been assumed that previous measles infection is associated with lifelong immunity. Well, that's actually proven, it's not just assumed. This idea was transferred to measles vaccination when the vaccine was developed in the 1950s. Hence, if someone had antibodies after vaccination, these were also assumed to provide lifelong protection. Well, it turns out that that was all completely wrong. Today, there are pockets of vulnerability in the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. In the vaccinated, there are bigger problems because it's not possible to achieve lifelong solid herd immunity. Unlike in the past, where measles was mainly in children, today we have to be concerned about everybody. I'm going to talk about the pockets of susceptibility in today's world. Today we have the vaccinated pockets and we have unvaccinated pockets of susceptibility, meaning people who, if they're exposed to the virus, could catch it and spread it. So we have primary vaccine failure, which is 2 to 10% of all vaccinees never responded at all to the vaccine. Dr. Poland, there's the reference. Secondary vaccine failure, 8.9 to 19% of children between 4 and 11 years after the vaccine will have not enough antibody to protect them. Then we have secondary failure over 20 years that I showed you that graph before. 33% lack protective titers, LeBaron. And then we have what I just discussed, vaccine escape mutants, which is a highly controversial subject matter that we're not supposed to talk about. But in the unvaccinated, we also have pockets of susceptibility, primarily in the medically exempted children and babies that are too young to be vaccinated, especially when their mothers don't supply immunity because they have vaccine version of immunity. However, a much larger group of susceptibles will be the vaccinated older children and adults who have lost their immunity. All this is a result of a medical system which once thought that one shot would stop measles the year after the program started, as Dr. Sensor said in America, and provide immunity for life, just like the disease does. And the public accepted it. I might have actually accepted it if I was told that we could stop this disease by giving part of the childhood vaccination one shot, part of the childhood population one shot. We'd get rid of measles forever, and I was unaware of the benefits of measles, and if measles was killing people, I might have agreed to that. But today, given all that I've just told you, we should be far wiser as more and more vaccines are brought into the schedule at younger and younger ages, and all ages, old, middle-aged, teenagers, HPV vaccines, it's causing major problems in our teenagers. While vaccine companies surpass financial expectations, I just saw another ad for Pfizer. The stock said that the stock rose unexpectedly high because the vaccines and the cancer drugs were doing so well. While fear campaigns amount to higher vaccine sales, we saw that with Merck after the scare in California. I showed in my other talk how the stock Bloomberg report showed that fear and measles outbreaks increases stock rates. While laws are being passed in America to stop our right to not vaccinate. In California, parents just lost their right to hold their children back from any vaccine if they want to send them to school. Our employees are now losing their jobs in hospitals if they don't agree to a yearly influenza vaccine, which we know is highly inefficient. There's talk in your country of making vaccines mandatory. And I talk to people everywhere I go saying, well, right now they're not mandatory, but the doctors are still really making me feel like a criminal if I don't do it. Drug companies monopolize what doctors learn in medical school. And vaccine inventors sit on the boards of vaccine advisory committees and tell doctors what vaccines should be given. We had that in America. We had a vaccine inventing doctor sitting on the advisory committee for immunization practices after he had made millions of dollars on the rotavirus vaccine. Little conflict of interest there, I think. While Merck virologists, if you're not aware of this, there's a case ongoing in America. It's been going on for about 10 years now, where these two virologists were working for Merck, helping to develop their vaccines, test their vaccines for safety and effectiveness. But it turned out that the mumps vaccine had actually lost its effectiveness because it had been passed through cells for so many decades that it became really weak. But in order to regain in order to maintain their patent for that vaccine, Merck had to prove a certain level of effectiveness, and they couldn't. It failed every time. So they tried all these other ways to get it to pass, which these virologists said, that's cheating. You can't do that. And Merck said, yes, we can. We're going to do it. And if you call the Justice Department, you will lose your job. But if you do what we say, you'll get a very nice bonus at the end of the year. Most virologists had a conscience, and they left. And they're now suing under the False Claims Act in America, alleging Merck's efforts to defraud the United States through Merck's ongoing scheme to sell the government a mumps vaccine that is mislabeled, misbranded, adulterated, and falsely certified as having an efficacy rate that is significantly higher than it actually is. And if you think that sounds bad, please go read about this. I've actually written about it. It's on my website. And there are lots of places. We even have links to the actual case, the brief, and all the details are in there. Right now, we have a top CDC scientist who confessed his sins, and nothing's happening. He was given a bonus, and he's still working for the CDC. He has not been brought in front of Congress. We have not had a hearing to find out what's really going on in the CDC. You know, this issue became really important to me when I saw my own patients severely harmed by vaccines. And at that point, I was still a vaccine believer. I was signing orders for influenza vaccines. I was signing orders for hepatitis B vaccines. I was signing orders to revaccinate people 2 and 3 times with 3 shots each time for hepatitis B because I believed in vaccines. And I saw the problems happen. And all I wanted was acknowledgement that the flu shot shut down my patient's kidneys, because that's what would have happened with any drug that shut down my patient's kidneys. I would have gone by, I would have said, acute kidney failure, dialysis dependent, secondary to X, and nobody would have said a word. But because it was a vaccine, I mean, it was just short of rotten tomatoes being thrown at me when I tried to bring this up. And I had to defend what I was seeing in front of my eyes. And I went to the medical literature, and I started reading about influenza. And then they said to me, but what about polio? Why are you attacking vaccines? What about polio? And I said, I don't know. I must be wonderful, because that's all I hear is polio vaccine is wonderful. But then I spent almost 2 years in the books doing nothing but reading about polio vaccines. And what I found was a nightmare. I couldn't believe the difference between what I had been taught and what actually happened. And I wrote a lot about that in the book. I don't have a vaccine-injured child. I'm not vaccine-injured. None of my family is vaccine-injured. This is not personal for me. I left my job that paid $300,000 a year to make nothing the first 3 years, and then $12,000 the next year. I did that because this is that important to me. Why is it important to me? Because the brains of our young people in the future are what's going to predict where the world is going to go. And so you can talk about GMOs and you can talk about all the other things that are going on, but if we keep injecting these substances into our babies and don't have the right to refuse them, we don't have a future. We're going to see the first generation where our children are institutionalized after we die. We're going to see the first generations where our children are dying before we do. We have a major problem on our hands. And to me, it's worth sacrificing everything in my life to get as many people as possible to at least start looking at the science. I'm not asking you to start to try to convert people to becoming anti-vaccine or saying any of the silly things that you hear both sides saying. I'm asking you to go and look at what's available and just see what you can learn yourself and show that maybe to some other people so that maybe a few babies can either have their vaccines delayed or even the ones that they really don't need stopped. But it's gotten to be too much. Our babies in America are getting dozens of vaccines with aluminium in them, dozens of them by the time they enter school. Our rates of brain damage are higher than we've ever seen in history. 1 in 6 of our children in America is on some sort of medication for a chronic disease. Our type 1 diabetes rates are through the ceiling. Our special education is almost a higher proportion than our regular education. Talk to a teacher that's 70 years of age or older. They're very valuable people to talk to because they're going to tell you how many of their children had peanut allergies, how many of their children needed inhalers, how many had latex allergies, how many were missing from influenza all the time. Today we see classrooms half empty in the era of vaccination. And we've got evidence that the flu shots are actually not providing herd immunity, but doing something completely different. That these influenza vaccines, as I presented the other night, are actually putting the vaccinated at a disadvantage to fight other strains of influenza and making them contagious for longer periods of time. This is the medical literature. These are some very pro-vaccine people that are writing these problems with the flu shots. But there's a big skew between the marketing and between the science. And a lot of very good doctors and scientists are even saying, what we're hearing, the hype we're hearing in the media, does not match up to the science. And you people are all quite capable of understanding the science. This is not physics, this is not rocket science. This is very basic biology, really, to understand. And you can go into deeper and deeper levels. But most people in this audience have some foundation of what's going on, and you can continue to build on that. And there are lots of parents who are influencing doctors and influencing their family and actually saving a lot of problems in young babies. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.